No doubt you've discovered that loyalty is no longer the currency of the realm, as your father believes.
Then what is?
I'm afraid currency is the currency of the realm.
Across the Spanish Main. Part 6. Hawkins and Drake. The legend begins. As they set sail for the Americas for the second time, Hawkins and his fleet were plagued by periods of flat calm, including one worrisome stretch of 18 days, which water supplies had to be rationed and the men's spirits fell while their tempers rose. Eventually the ships entered the belt of the easterly trades, known to the 16th century seamen as the ordinary breezes, and with the wind at their quarters, scudded across the Atlantic to the Caribbean. Still, it was March before Hawkins dropped anchor at the island of Margarita off the coast of Venezuela, where the Spanish maintained a pearl fishery. At first, it all seemed like a repeat of his cordial welcome by the Hispaniolas. The mayor of the island's small town was effusive in his greetings. According to a journal kept by one John Spark, a gentleman adventurer aboard the Jesus, the Spanish mayor had gifted them both sheep and beef for the refreshing of the men. But when the island's governor was informed of Hawkins' desire for trade, he proved a testy, officious, and definitely uncooperative fellow. He absolutely refused to sanction the sale of Hawkins' slaves, citing King Philip's royal injunction against dealing with foreigners. Further, to make any trading as difficult as possible for the Englishmen, he also denied them the services of a local pilot that they had hired. Neither Hawkins nor any member of his crew had ever seen this coast, and navigating without the benefit of expert help would cost them precious time and trade. Finally, as soon as Hawkins had departed, the governor made haste to inform the authorities at Santo Domingo, capital of Spanish America, that an Englishman was attempting to trade on the Main. The response was an edict forbidding all Spaniards to have any sort of contact with this impudent interloper. Hawkins sailed south to the mainland of South America, where he and his men traded a few pewter whistles, knives, glasses, and other trinkets to the friendly Indians for New World foods. Tasting sweet potatoes for the first time, young Spark declared them to be the most delicate roots that may be eaten, and to far exceed our parsnips or carrots. The pineapple looked like a pine cone, he related, but of the bigness of 2 fists, and more delicious than any sweet apple sugared. The Indians were probably Chibcha, remnants of the once populous tribe that had spread throughout the Caribbean before the white men came, and these survivors of Spanish slaughter, Spark learned, were now assailing the hated conquerors. They were excellent hunters, he wrote, and skilled with bow and arrow. The Spaniards, for fear thereof, armed themselves and their horses with quilted canvas of 2 inches thick, and leave no place of their body open to their enemies, saving their eyes, which they may not hide. And yet oftentimes they are hit in that so small a scantling. Hawkins had now been under way from Africa for 2 months. His slaves, chained in the ship's holds under inhuman conditions, were weakening and dying in considerable numbers. His supplies of beans were getting low. Anxiously, he pressed on west along South America's northern coast until, on April 3rd, he came to a settlement of Borburata, near present-day Caracas. There, at least, he found buyers for his slaves. The Spaniards at first cited the various decrees forbidding them to traffic with foreigners, to which Hawkins responded that he was a peaceful and honest trader. English merchants freely called at Spanish Flanders, the Canaries, and Spain itself, he argued. What difference was there between one part of Spanish Empire and another? Finally, the Spaniards allowed Hawkins to bring 30 slaves ashore, but they haggled so vigorously over the price that Hawkins became angry. According to Spark, Hawkins told the Spaniards in exasperation that it was not only license he sought, but profit, which he perceived was not there to be had, so therefore he would seek it further. At this point the local governor arrived and commenced an elaborate charade that only annoyed the impatient Hawkins more. First, to provide himself with an alibi for dealing with the Englishmen, the governor required Hawkins to petition that he would come thither in a ship of Queen Majesty's of England, being bound off Guinea, and thither driven by the wind and weather, so that being come thither, he had need of sundry necessities for the reparation of the said navy, and also great need of money for the repayment of his soldiers. That accomplished, the governor granted the Englishman a license to sell the slaves. But then greed got the better of the Spaniard, and he demanded a special 7.5% tax, plus a 30 ducat customs fee on every slave sold. In a fury, Hawkins marched 100 of his men, armed with bows, arrows, harquebuses, and pikes, into the town square and, by one Spaniard's account, threatened that he would not leave a thing standing unless the levies were dropped. The governor quickly backed down, and Hawkins sold 30 slaves. But force had settled the issue for Hawkins, and as his voyage continued, he began to use force or threat of force as a standard tool of his trade. At the next large Spanish settlement, Rio de la Hacha, 350 miles west along the coast, the timid Spanish authorities again demanded that Hawkins engage in pretense. They suggested this time, according to the later testimony at a Spanish court of inquiry, that Hawkins threatened and feigned to intend to burn down the houses of the town in order that the residents might prove that they were forced to trade with him. Hawkins acted out the charade, but then, just as at Borborata, complications developed further. The Spaniards announced that they would pay only half the asking price for the slaves. Hawkins, knowing that he was once again being tested, landed again 100 men and some artillery. The Spanish rallied 180 soldiers to face the invasion, but one blast from Hawkins' cannon sent them diving for cover, and seconds later, before a man was injured on either side, they called for a truce. Soon, trade began in earnest. The English remained in Rio de la Hacha for more than a fortnight, selling quantities of wine, flour, cloth, linens, and clothing, as well as 300 slaves. In payment, the English received gold, silver, and pearls worth perhaps 6,600 pounds. Hawkins had now disposed of all his cargo for a sum exceeding 10,000 pounds in total, and on May 31st, 1565, the Jesus of Lubeck and her small squadron set a northerly course towards Hispaniola and then sailed west, following the winds and currents until they could round Cuba and head east again, riding the Gulf Stream through the Straits of Florida. On his way home, Hawkins stopped at the French Huguenot settlement of Fort Caroline, established the year before along the North American coast. Queen Elizabeth had supported the French attempt to establish a base in the New World and instructed Hawkins to check out how the settlers were faring. He found them in quite a desperate condition, notwithstanding the natural abundance of the surrounding land. The country was marvelously sweet, and the ground doth yield victuals sufficient, if they would have taken pains to get the same, reported Spark. But they, being soldiers, desired to live by the sweat of other men's brows. The other men Spark mentioned were the Indians, who, after welcoming the French, had turned hostile when the Huguenots demanded more and more from them. They had practically laid siege to the fort, often ambushing colonists who ventured into the countryside. By the time Hawkins arrived, the Frenchmen were reduced to surviving on acorns, and only 40 of the original 300 settlers were in reasonably good health. René du Laudonnière, the French leader, told Hawkins that he planned to leave unless help came soon from home. Hawkins sold Laudonnière one of his empty ships, the Tiger, and all the provisions he could spare. Then Hawkins sailed for home, fully expecting the French to follow. The date was July 28, 1565. It was only a month later that Jean Ribault arrived at Fort Caroline with the long-awaited reinforcements, and in his wake came the merciless Pedro Menendez de Aviles, the Spanish admiral who slaughtered Ribault's men and most of Fort Caroline's male settlers in the name of God's service. The Jesus of Lubeck arrived back in England on September 20th, 1565, with her 2 small companions trailing along like ducklings in the wake of a mother mallard. Hawkins and his backers had every reason to be pleased. After expenses, the voyage netted a profit estimated between 45 and 60%. The hope of much greater profits was implicit in a letter from Hawkins to Elizabeth, in which he wrote that he had always been a help to all Spaniards and Portugals that have come in his way, although many times in his track they have been under my power. He was obviously feeling on top of the world, and in November, when he was invited to dine in London with the Spanish ambassador, Don Guzman de Silva, Hawkins was only too happy to oblige. At the meeting, de Silva probably learned little that he had not already known, but Hawkins' self-assurance and obvious abilities were enough to alarm the ambassador, and he wrote King Philip urging decisive action, but not yet. "It may be best," he wrote, "to dissemble so as to capture and castigate him on his next voyage." In a second meeting with Hawkins, the ambassador was blandly assured by the Englishman that he would not return to the Indies without the Spanish king's permission. De Silva did not believe it, and again reflected his concern in a dispatch to Philip, writing, "It seems advisable to get this man out of the country, so that he may not teach others, for they have good ships and are greedy folk with more liberty than is good for them." Whether he was dissembling or not, de Silva protested vigorously in the spring of 1567 when he learned that Hawkins was planning yet another voyage. This time, as de Silva's spies reported, Queen Elizabeth was placing 2 of her warships at Hawkins' disposal, the Jesus of Lubeck again, and the smaller Minion, an armed vessel of 300 tons. Hawkins said publicly that he was only going to Africa in search of gold, but the ambassador demanded assurances from the Queen herself that the expedition would steer clear of the Caribbean. Elizabeth coolly told the Spanish ambassador half the truth. A little later, de Silva learned that Hawkins's ships were loading on beans, the standard provision for slaves, and also rich silks, much admired by New World colonial planters. A few weeks later, the ambassador filed a second formal protest. This time, Elizabeth explicitly and stoutly denied that Hawkins was bound for the West Indies. If, in fact, the Spanish were dissembling in hopes of getting Hawkins in their clutches, Elizabeth and Hawkins were masters at the same game of falsehood. All during the summer of 1567, Hawkins continued to assemble and fit out his fleet at Portsmouth. To accompany the Jesus and the Minion, he himself furnished 4 smaller ships totaling 333 tons. The William and John, the Swallow, the Angel, and the Judith. The expedition's crew numbered 408 men, and among them Hawkins's cousin, a tough-minded and experienced young seafarer named Francis Drake. By the end of August, preparations were nearly complete, and now came a Spanish reaction, somewhat more ominous than Ambassador de Silva's cries of diplomatic protest. On a fine summer day, a squadron of 7 Spanish warships appeared in Plymouth Sound. The Spaniards failed to strike their colors and topsails, as was customary when entering a foreign port, and pressed on toward the inner harbor where Hawkins's fleet lay. As soon as Hawkins saw the Spaniards, he opened with a warning shot, and continued the cannon fire until they bore off and made a required salute. Anchoring in a cove near Plymouth, the Spanish commander complained to the officials of his treatment, insisting that he bore no malice. The Spaniards then sailed away, but the Spanish ambassador took his countrymen's protest to Queen Elizabeth directly. So, on October 2nd, 1567, John Hawkins took his 6 ships out of Plymouth and down the Channel into the Atlantic. This voyage to Africa was beset by storms. The Jesus took a battering and sprang a number of leaks. Hawkins made repairs at Tenerife in the Canaries and pushed on to the Guinea coast of Africa. But this time it was no easy matter for the Englishmen to collect a cargo of slaves. Since Hawkins's last voyage to the Guinea coast, Portugal had seriously begun to enforce its monopoly of the African trade. No local slavers would sell to him, so Hawkins was forced to chase down his own chattel. At the end of November, a number of his men were wounded during an attack on an African village, and 8 died in agony, their jaws locked shut from poisoned arrows. Hawkins himself was wounded but quickly recovered. At one point, the frustrated Englishman took a Portuguese caravel that had been abandoned by its owners when French corsairs attacked and burned a coastal town. Hawkins hoped that the small vessel could be used to sail up shallow rivers where slaves might be bought or captured. Over the next few weeks, he acquired 3 more ships, a small bark purchased from the Portuguese, and a pair of small armed French ships whose captains decided to join his enterprise. Now, 10 ships strong, Hawkins's squadron cruised southeast to Sierra Leone. There, his slaving parties pushed farther inland in search of their quarry, and 2 seamen drowned in a swampy river when their small pinnacle foundered and sank after colliding with a hippopotamus. By January 12, 1568, Hawkins had taken scarcely 150 slaves, and by his own count he had nothing wherewith to seek the coast of the West Indies. The expedition might have ended then and there, except for a sudden and dramatic reversal of fortune. A local African king in Sierra Leone, laying siege to an enemy town, negotiated for help with the well-armed Englishmen, promising in return that they could take the prisoners. Hawkins quickly agreed. When the town was subdued, Hawkins loaded his ship with 260 more slaves and set a course west to the Caribbean. It took more than 7 weeks to cross the Atlantic, and a discouraged Hawkins noted in his log that this was more hard than he had ever been accustomed. There was even more frustration in store when the visitors reached the settlements on the Spanish Main and discovered that local officials were even less eager to trade than they had been previously. By the time they reached Boborata, where the trade had been relatively easy before, Hawkins had decided to take matter into his own hands. When the new governor showed reluctance to give him a license, Hawkins simply declared that he needed none, and without further ado set up booths on the shore and traded for more than a month, while his powerful armed fleet rode at anchor in the bay behind him. The Englishmen faced harder resistance when they reached Rio de la Hacha, where a local official assembled a troop of armed men to defend the town, as they had during Hawkins' previous visit. Francis Drake, now in command of the Judith, entered the harbor first and demanded leave to fill his water casks. The Spanish opened fire, and Drake, in quick response, sent 2 shot flying into the colonial treasure house, and then anchored out of range until the rest of the fleet arrived. Hawkins landed with 200 men, routed the ragtag defenders, captured the port, and set fire to several houses. The colonists indicated their fervent desire for peace, and Hawkins in turn promised to pay for the damages his men had done. Thus, wrote Hawkins, "We obtained a secret trade, whereupon the Spaniards bought from us a number of 200 slaves." Word of Hawkins's firmness may have preceded him to the next settlement at Santa Marta, for there, after a chat with the local officials, Hawkins feigned a conquest, putting ashore 150 men and shooting out of the ships half a score of shot over the town for color. The quote-unquote defeated Spaniards gladly bought 110 slaves from Hawkins, and the Englishmen departed with good wishes all around after just a few days. But neither confrontation nor negotiation worked any magic at the next port, Cartagena, the most important city on the South American mainland. Behind their massive fortifications, the Cartagenians coldly rebuffed the English traders. Noted Hawkins, "We could no by means obtain to deal with any Spaniard, the governor was so straight." To show his determination to trade, he sent the minion to bombard the town, but the Cartagenian shore batteries answered shot for shot, and Hawkins soon called off the fruitless exchange. On July 24th, outside Cartagena, he paid off and said farewell to one of the French captains who had joined him, and he sank a second vessel, now unneeded, that he had acquired in Africa. Then, with his remaining 8 ships, Hawkins set sail for the Straits of Florida, hoping to set home before a storm season started. He hoped in vain.